The unfinished conversation. The sun had barely begun its descent behind the hazy Hollywood skyline when Sandra Bullock stood alone on the wraparound balcony of her secluded Lowe's Angels home, the wind gently tugging at the soft sleeves of her linen shirt. Below her, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, tires humming, lives rushing forward. But Sandra's world at that moment felt entirely still. It wasn't the kind of stillness that brings peace. It was the haunting, echoing silence that settles after a heart has been too full, for too long, with words unspoken. 20 years, that's how long it had been since speed changed their lives. Since the world first fell in love with that electric, magnetic connection between a fierce woman and a gentle man hurtling through life's chaos at full speed. But for Sandra, the real story hadn't been on the screen. The real story had begun in the quiet, in-between moments, shared laughter on set, the way Keanu's eyes always searched the room before he spoke, the gentle way he listened like every word she said mattered. And it wasn't love, not then. Not in the Hollywood way, not in the fairytale way. It was something softer, slower, more sacred. But what she never told him, what she could never bring herself to say, was that she had fallen in love with his kindness before she even realized she had fallen in love with him. Now, standing on this balcony with the city shimmering beneath her and a letter clutched in her hand, Sandra knew. The time to speak had finally arrived. But how do you begin a conversation that's 2 decades overdue? Rewind 2 weeks earlier to a chilly autumn evening in New York City. Sandra was in town for a quiet charity gala, no flashing lights, no red carpets, just a room full of people trying to make the world a little better. She wasn't even planning to attend, not until she heard Keanu might be there. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year. Life had drifted them apart again, as it always did. Different movies, different cities, different silences, but something in her heart pulled her there. Maybe it was the way she'd been feeling lately, disconnected, emotionally weightless, as though she'd been moving through rooms full of people without ever truly being seen. Or maybe it was the letter she had started writing 3 times and kept hiding in drawers across 3 different homes. The moment she walked into the candlelit ballroom, she spotted him, not because he was trying to be seen, but because he never was. Keanu stood in the corner, nursing what looked like black coffee in a wine glass, his suit crisp but unassuming, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. He was the same, yet entirely different. Older, certainly. But there was a kind of grace to him now, carved by solitude and time, that made him seem almost translucent. When he turned and saw her, the smile that broke across his face was the kind that people write poetry about. That soft, warm kind that says, "I've missed you," without needing to say it out loud. And she smiled back, but only her lips smiled. Her eyes, as usual, betrayed more. They talked that night, not about love, not yet, about her new rescue dog, about a script he was reading, about nothing and everything. About life in the way only people who have seen each other at both their best and most broken can talk. They laughed. A lot. But beneath it all was a quiet vibration neither dared acknowledge, the ghost of 1,000 words unsaid. When he walked her to her hotel room door, something in the air shifted. The hallway grew heavy. She wanted to say, "Stay." Not because she needed romance, not because she was lonely, but because she wanted to sit beside him, to be still in his presence. But instead, she said, "Good night," and watched him disappear down the corridor. It wasn't until the door clicked shut behind her that she felt it, that ache that comes from not saying what your heart is screaming. The next morning, she left New York without telling him goodbye. Back in LA, the letter resurfaced. She found it in her nightstand, folded like a wound. "Dear Keanu," it began, "there's something I've never said aloud because I was afraid it might ruin the beautiful thing we have." She never finished it, never signed it, never sent it. But something had shifted in her soul. The old fears of being misunderstood, of breaking what didn't need fixing, were no longer enough to justify the silence. She had spent a lifetime being brave on screen, yet terrified off it. Until now. She picked up the letter, grabbed a pen, and sat by the open window as the breeze carried in the scent of orange blossoms and distant rain. This time she didn't stop writing. This time the truth poured out of her like light through a cracked vase. Meanwhile, across the city, Keanu sat in his modest kitchen, stirring honey into a cup of tea. His phone buzzed quietly on the table. "Sandra Bullock, I wrote you something. Not a script, just words. Let me know if you're around. I'll come to you." His hand stilled. He reread the message 5 times, each time feeling something deeper unravel in his chest. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered the moment they met for the first time. How she had walked into the room like sunlight, her energy chaotic and contagious, and how, even then, he had known she would be one of the few people in his life he could truly trust. And trust her he did, with everything except perhaps his own heart. Now she was coming, and something told him this wasn't just any conversation. It was the one they had never had, the one they had danced around in interviews, dodged in long-distance phone calls, buried beneath years of friendship and what-ifs. He cleaned the apartment, not because he needed to impress her, but because something inside him knew that when she walked through that door, everything would change. And when she finally arrived, wearing no makeup, hair tied in a loose knot, letter clutched in her trembling fingers, Keanu did something she had not expected. He didn't ask what the letter said. He didn't rush her. He simply opened his arms and pulled her into the quietest, most honest hug either of them had ever known. And in that embrace, before a single word was spoken, Sandra knew. He already knew what she was going to say. But still, the promise needed to be made. And so she whispered into the place between his neck and shoulder, voice barely audible. "I should have told you this years ago." The promise. The morning after their embrace, Sandra sat on the edge of Keanu's simple, sun-washed couch, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug that felt far more comforting than any overpriced Hollywood espresso ever had. Keanu moved quietly in the kitchen, the way he always did, like a whisper instead of a man, a shadow with warmth. The scent of toasted sourdough and vanilla chai drifted through the apartment, settling over the quiet like a warm blanket. Neither of them spoke much, not yet. There was a reverence in the air, like two people standing inside a cathedral of unspoken history, where every smile was a stained glass window and every sigh echoed with memories left unsaid. The letter still sat between them on the old wooden coffee table, folded now, not out of avoidance but preservation, like something sacred that had already done its job. She had read it to him the night before, not all in one breath, but slowly, pausing every few lines, her voice catching on the words she'd feared for years. She had told him everything, how his kindness had been her anchor through 1,000 storms, how his silence had been louder than any man's declarations, how she had watched him move through grief with grace, and how that same grace had quietly rearranged the furniture inside her soul. She told him how there had been other men, yes, some public, some private, but none of them had ever understood her laughter the way he did or honored her silence without trying to fix it. She told him how she had watched him grieve Jennifer and Ava, their memories lingering like phantom lights in his eyes, and how she had never dared to intrude on that space, even though her heart had always wanted to stand beside him in it. And finally, she told him the truth that changed everything. "I never needed to be loved in the way others expect. I just wanted to be loved by you in whatever way your soul allowed." After the final words were read, he hadn't spoken, not right away. He simply reached for her hand and held it, his thumb tracing small circles on her wrist like he was memorizing her pulse. And in that moment, Sandra realized she hadn't been waiting for him to say something. She had been waiting for herself to finally let go of the weight she'd been carrying all these years. But now, as the sun filtered through the blinds and their silence softened into comfort, it was Keanu who finally broke it. Not with grand declarations, but with a question that came not from his mouth, but from his soul. "What would you want this to be, if we could start again?" Sandra didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around his home. It was modest, clean. There were books stacked in every corner, philosophy, poetry, science fiction, memoirs, like quiet companions who had kept him company through the years. On the walls hung photographs, not of himself, but of people he had loved and lost and found again, his mother, River Phoenix, the dog from John Wick, and a tiny Polaroid of her, taped onto the edge of a bookshelf like a secret shrine. She set the mug down and turned to face him completely. "I don't want red carpets. I don't want to be your Hollywood ending," she said, voice steady now. "I want to be your morning coffee, your phone call after a bad dream, your reason to breathe easier. I want the version of you that never needed to perform." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes never leaving hers. "And I want the version of you that doesn't always have to be strong," he whispered. "I've seen Sandra Bullock save the world, but I want Sandy, the one who hides in her kitchen after award shows and eats cereal barefoot, the one who still laughs at the same dumb jokes from the Speed set." They sat there for a long while, hands intertwined, the years folding themselves neatly between them like pages of a well-worn book finally returning to its spine. And then, Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out something that made his eyebrows raise. A small, weathered matchbox with the words "The Promise" scribbled across it in black ink. "I've been carrying this around since 2006, she said, smiling sheepishly. "Do you remember that night in Vancouver?" Keanu's face softened. He did. It had been late after a rap party. The two of them had escaped the noise, wandered into a tiny bookstore that was about to close. They had joked about writing their own story one day, not as actors, but as people. She had bought the matchbox from the bookstore counter, said it would be the title of their book, The Promise. "You said it sounded like a sad French movie," she laughed. "And you said sad French movies always told the truth," Keanu added. She opened the matchbox now. Inside was a slip of paper, creased and yellowed. On it were 5 words. "If not now, then when?" Keanu exhaled slowly, the weight of that question settling over both of them like a quiet revolution. "That's my promise," Sandra said. "I won't let time be the thief of things we never dared to reach for." He looked at her for a long moment, not just at her face, but into her, a gaze that made her feel not seen but known. "Then here's mine," he said, voice low, certain. "No more waiting for the perfect time. Let's start with what's true right now." Sandra smiled, and for the first time in years it wasn't guarded. It wasn't for the cameras. It was pure. It was the smile of a woman who had finally stepped into her own truth and been met there, not with fear, but with arms open wide. And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, Keanu leaned in, not for a kiss, but to rest his forehead against hers. A touch so gentle, so full of meaning, it said what 1,000 scripts never could. "We have a lot to untangle," she murmured. "I'm not in a rush," he replied. "Some knots aren't meant to be cut, they're meant to be understood." The rest of the day unfolded not in climaxes, but in quiet moments. The way she made fun of his weird tea collection, the way he laughed when she tried to reorganize his bookshelf, the way they sat on the floor eating sandwiches and watching the rain turn LA golden. It was the beginning of something unglamorous, something private, something sacred. And as the night wrapped itself around them, and they lit a single candle from that old matchbox, Sandra whispered into the quiet. This is our story now." And Keanu, ever the poet in a monk's clothing, whispered back. "One day someone will tell it, but until then, let's just live it." What could have been, what still can be. The following days didn't feel like a whirlwind. They weren't chaotic, weren't dramatic, weren't punctuated by stolen kisses or explosive declarations like the tabloids might imagine. No, what unfolded between Sandra and Keanu in those quietly borrowed days felt more like the unfurling of a long-forgotten letter found beneath floorboards, every line already written in their hearts, simply waiting to be read aloud with courage. It was slow, purposeful, sacred. And in many ways, more romantic than any love story they had ever been paid to perform on screen. They didn't rush into answers. Instead, they asked questions. "What's your biggest fear right now?" Sandra had asked one morning, curled beside him on the couch as the early sunlight streaked across the hardwood floors like spilled gold. Keanu had taken a long pause before answering. "That the time I didn't speak hurt you more than the words I could have said." Sandra looked at him then, not with blame, but with an aching softness. "No," she said quietly. "What hurt was not trusting myself enough to ask for what I truly needed." Those moments kept surfacing, like stars blinking into view at dusk. Each night held quiet conversations about choices not made, roles not taken, invitations declined, and the many quiet ways life had conspired to keep them dancing just outside each other's reach. They weren't mourning what had been lost. They were mapping what was still possible. It was on a walk through Runyon Canyon that Sandra finally let the wall down completely. They had taken the trail in silence for most of the climb, breathing in the dusty scent of sage and sun-scorched earth, their hands brushing occasionally, fingers grazing like they were learning how to speak a forgotten language. At the top, with the city sprawling beneath them, Keanu pulled out a small thermos from his bag, coffee, of course, strong and a little too bitter, and poured it into 2 mismatched travel mugs. They sat side by side, legs stretched out, wind tugging gently at their hair, the world below humming obliviously. "Do you ever think about the version of us that actually happened?" she asked suddenly. Keanu looked at her. "You mean the real one, or the one we never had?" "Both." He didn't answer immediately. He never did. It was one of the things she had loved about him even before she realized it was love, his refusal to rush, to speak just to fill silence. When Keanu spoke, it was always after he had let the words steep inside his soul. "I think about the version of us that stayed in touch after Lake House," he said finally. "The one where I didn't go into that shell. The one where you didn't think you had to be okay all the time just because people expected you to be strong." Sandra felt the wind whip against her cheek, or maybe it was just emotion. She wasn't sure. "I think about that version too," she said. "But more than that, I think about what it would have meant for us to fail, and how scared I was of losing you completely." Keanu turned toward her. His eyes weren't just soft, they were raw, like an open sky after a storm. "I would have let you go," he said, "even if I wanted to stay because I thought I wasn't allowed to need you." Those words cracked something wide open. Sandra didn't cry, not fully, but her breath hitched and she looked away, blinking hard at the horizon. "I wish someone had told us back then," she whispered, "that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, that two broken people can still build something whole." Keanu reached over, took her hand, and gently laced his fingers with hers. "They're telling us now," he said. "We just have to listen." Back at Sandra's home later that week, they found themselves in her kitchen, music playing from an old vinyl player. Etta James, rich and full and timeless. The late afternoon light cast a golden hue across the counters as Sandra chopped vegetables for dinner and Keanu stirred something in a pot that neither of them were truly paying attention to. It was domestic, beautifully mundane. At one point, she turned around, spoon in hand, ready to tease him for burning the sauce. But the moment she saw him, she stopped. He was leaning against the counter, looking at her with the kind of stillness that demanded reverence. As if she were not a woman slicing carrots in sweatpants, but a cathedral wrapped in light. "What?" she asked, laughing nervously, wiping her hands on a towel. "You look like home," he said. And in that moment, the years they had spent pretending they were only friends fell away. The dinners with other people, the interviews filled with safe answers, the public masks, all of it dissolved, leaving behind two souls who had finally stopped hiding from themselves. That night after dinner and a shared bottle of wine and slow dancing barefoot in the living room, Sandra pulled out a box she had been keeping for years. It was filled with photos, not the ones you post online. These were old Polaroids from set, notes scribbled on napkins, ticket stubs from late-night movie marathons, and tiny memories she had tucked away, not for nostalgia but for safekeeping. "I kept these," she said, spreading them out on the floor between them. "Because even when we weren't talking, I couldn't let go of what you meant to me." Keanu picked up a photo, one of her asleep on a crew chair, him beside her, arms folded, watching her like a guardian. "I remember this day," he said softly. "I didn't sleep the night before. I'd been grieving, but you made me laugh that morning, for the first time in weeks." They sat there for hours, time folding around them like an embrace. Each photo, each scrap of memory became a brick in the foundation of something new, something built not on fantasy or timing but truth. And then, as the clock ticked past midnight, Sandra said something she had never dared to voice. "If we do this, really do this, promise me one thing." "Anything," Keanu said. "That we don't let fear become the narrator of our story again." Keanu smiled then, not the shy, hesitant smile he gave the world, but the full, bright, unwavering one that only those who had earned his trust got to see. "I promise." And with that single word, spoken in the hush between one day and the next, everything changed. Not in the way stories end, but in the way the real ones finally begin. A life between the lines. There's a certain kind of silence that exists between two people who have finally told the truth. It's not heavy. It's not awkward. It's the kind of silence that breathes, that holds space for what hasn't been said yet, not out of fear, but out of tenderness. That was the silence Sandra and Keanu now shared, as the world around them continued its unrelenting rhythm, and yet, somehow they had stepped outside of it, as though wrapped in a different kind of time, one that moved not by seconds and minutes, but by moments and meaning. The morning after they made their promises, Sandra awoke to the smell of espresso and the soft rustle of newspaper pages being turned. Her house, usually so meticulously ordered and quiet, now held signs of another life. His jacket draped over the back of a chair, 2 coffee cups drying near the sink, a book of Rumi poems left open on the kitchen table like a breadcrumb trail leading straight into his soul. She followed the scent of coffee into the garden, where Keanu sat cross-legged on one of her stone benches, bathed in golden morning light, reading and smiling to himself in that quiet, enigmatic way she had come to adore. For a long time, she didn't say a word. She simply watched him, a man who had built his world on simplicity and solitude, now finding room for someone more. She wondered how many people had misunderstood him over the years. How many had seen only the surface, the stoic, haunted elegance, without ever daring to step past the facade. And how lucky she was to have found her way behind that curtain to the place where his kindness bloomed like wildflowers in spring. "You're up early," she finally said, her voice still sleep-heavy. Keanu looked up, his eyes softening immediately. "I didn't want to wake you. You looked peaceful." Sandra sat beside him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "I dreamt we were filming again, but it wasn't a movie. It was just life." He smiled at that. Maybe it always was. They spent the morning talking about nothing and everything. About how odd it felt not to be on a set or at a premiere. About the strange beauty of aging in a world obsessed with youth. About grief, hers, the kind you carry like luggage you never unpack. And about the joy that comes when you stop pretending you aren't carrying it. That day marked the beginning of what would become a quiet routine. No grand declarations, no pressure to define anything. Just the slow weaving of a new life, one filled with breakfasts on the porch, late-night drives through Mulholland under moonlight, and shared playlists that somehow always landed on a Leonard Cohen song when the moment needed it most. But not everyone understood. It began with a headline: Sandra and Keanu, just friends or something more. Then came the paparazzi photos, the grainy shots of them laughing at a bookstore, a blurry image of Keanu holding her hand at a farmer's market. The online speculation exploded, forums dissected every glance, every quote, every silence between them. And suddenly, the private sanctuary they had begun to build was pierced by the noise of public curiosity. Sandra was used to it. The media had followed her through marriages, breakups, and every red carpet in between. But this was different. This wasn't a studio-approved romance or a scripted scandal. This was real. And because of that, it felt infinitely more fragile. One night, as they sat in her living room with the fire flickering low and a storm tapping against the windows, she turned to him with that familiar look, the one that said her heart was heavier than her words could carry. "Maybe we were better when no one was watching." Keanu didn't flinch. He took her hand, grounding her instantly. "They've always been watching, Sandy," he said. "But for once we don't owe them a performance. We owe ourselves the truth." She leaned her head on his shoulder, exhaling the tension of 1,000 camera flashes. "But what if the truth gets torn apart by their noise?" "Then we protect it," he whispered. "Not by hiding, but by holding it so close they can't reach it." And that became their quiet revolution. They didn't issue statements. They didn't confirm or deny. They simply lived, together, authentically. And the world, for all its noise, couldn't seem to shake the sense that what they were witnessing wasn't scandal or fiction, but something holy, something earned. As weeks turned into months, Sandra found herself healing in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Not just from broken relationships or career disappointments, but from the subtle ways life had chipped away at her belief in intimacy. She no longer felt the need to fill silences with cleverness. She didn't mask her exhaustion with makeup or jokes. She was, for the first time in years, wholly herself. And Keanu, he didn't flinch from that. He welcomed it, encouraged it, celebrated it. One evening, they visited her sister's family. Kids running barefoot through the yard, laughter echoing across the patio, grilled corn on the cob, and sticky hands. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't curated. But when her niece crawled into Keanu's lap with a book and he read to her with all the gentleness of a monk reading sacred scripture, Sandra felt something deep inside her soften into certainty. This was a man she could build forever with. Later that night, as they drove back through the hills, Sandra looked over and saw him, hand on the wheel, hair slightly tousled, humming to a melody she didn't recognize. "I want to tell you something," she said, voice quiet. Keanu glanced at her. "Always. I used to think the greatest love story I'd ever live was the one I pretended to have in movies. But now, I think this, what we have, it's the one I'd trade them all for." He didn't respond right away. Just reached across the center console and laced his fingers with hers, the streetlights casting golden streaks across their joined hands. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost," he said, "a future." And as they turned onto her street, the city glowing behind them like a dream finally caught, Sandra whispered the words she had once only dared write in hidden letters. I love you, Keanu. He pulled the car to a stop, turned to her, and smiled, not with surprise, but with the kind of quiet joy that comes when you've been waiting for something your soul already knew was coming. I've loved you for a long time, he said, and now I finally get to show you. The letter that broke the silence. Life has a strange way of testing the very things we hold close, as if the universe wants to know whether we are ready to protect the treasures we've finally dared to claim. For weeks, Sandra and Keanu had built something soft yet sturdy, like a home woven out of whispered truths and quiet promises. Their days were filled with small rituals, shared breakfasts on sunlit patios, evening walks through dimly lit neighborhoods where they could simply exist without being recognized, and long conversations that stretched far into the night, peeling back years of wounds, hopes, and the kind of dreams adults rarely speak aloud. But neither of them were naive. They knew that life outside their cocoon was louder, harsher, and often unforgiving, especially toward two people whose lives had been dissected by headlines for decades. Still, they believed that what they were building was stronger than gossip, stronger than speculation, stronger than shadows. What they didn't expect was how quickly the outside world would find its way into the quiet sanctuary of their rediscovered love. It happened one afternoon in late November. Sandra was sitting in her office, looking over a script she had been offered, a heartfelt drama about grief and reconciliation. She was thinking of how differently she now understood those themes, how deeply they resonated with the new tenderness blooming in her life. Just as she reached for her tea, her phone buzzed with a notification from her team. Urgent. Online rumors escalating. Need your attention ASAP. Her breath tightened. She clicked the link. A gossip site had published a supposed leak, a letter written years ago claiming to be from Sandra confessing her love for Keanu. The article was filled with invasive speculation, framing their story as a secret affair that stretched through marriages and tragedies. Old photos were twisted into fabricated narratives. Anonymous sources painted her as unstable, him as cold, and their entire bond as a decades-long scandal. At first, Sandra sat frozen, the world blurring around her as familiarity spiraled into dread. She had always been thick-skinned, capable of brushing off lies, rumors, and fabricated stories. But this was different. It wasn't about career. It wasn't about image. It was about their truth, the fragile, blooming connection she had worked so hard to nurture with Keanu. And now it felt as though the world had ripped the petals from their flower before it even had a chance to fully bloom. She couldn't bring herself to call him, not yet. Her voice wasn't steady. Her thoughts were fragments, fear, betrayal, tenderness, confusion, anger. She paced around her house for nearly an hour, trying to find the right words, the right explanation, the right tone. But everything inside her felt shaken, not because she was ashamed of the truth, but because she feared what this exposure might cost them. Keanu arrived long before she had the courage to call. He appeared at her door with the same calm presence he always carried, though his eyes held a storm she recognized immediately. He didn't use the front entrance. He didn't ring the bell. Somehow, instinctively, he knew she needed him before she even opened her mouth. "I saw it," he said softly. Sandra swallowed hard. "It wasn't real. I never wrote that letter. It's a fake. I swear, Keanu." "I know," he interrupted, stepping closer, his voice sure but gentle. She blinked, startled. "You know." He nodded. "I know your handwriting. I know your heart. And that wasn't either of them." Tears welled in her eyes, not from the rumor itself, but from the simple, unwavering faith in his voice. Keanu stepped forward, cupping her face with hands that had carried both heartbreak and healing. "What hurt me," she whispered, "wasn't the rumor. It was the thought that you might doubt me, or think I'd ever use something so personal to manipulate a story." Keanu shook his head, brushing his thumb gently under her cheek. "Sandra, there's nothing in you that has ever been manipulative. Not with me, not with anyone. I've known you for 30 years. I've seen you laugh with your whole heart and cry with the parts of it you never show to the world. And not once have you ever used someone's vulnerability against them." Her breath trembled. "But what if this destroys everything?" she whispered, voice barely a thread. "What if people twist this into something it is? What if they turn us into headlines again? I don't want to be a story, Keanu, not like that. Not when what we have is still growing." He pulled her into a long embrace, the kind that steadied storms, the kind she had leaned into more times than she could count. She buried her face into his chest, breathing in the faint scent of cedar and peppermint, comfort, truth, and home. "We can't control the world," he murmured into her hair. But we can control us, and I won't let noise drown out the truth between us, not this time, not ever again. Sandra let out a trembling exhale. Then what do we do? Keanu pulled back slightly, his eyes locked onto hers with a quiet resolve. We tell the truth, not to them but to each other, every day, every moment. She stared at him, her heart unspooling. I don't want this to break us, she whispered. He gently held her hand, guiding her to sit beside him on the couch. Let me tell you something, he said softly. When River died, the world tore me apart with stories. When Jennifer passed, they did it again. And through all of it, you were the one voice I trusted. You never asked for details I couldn't give. You never tried to fix the parts of me that were shattered. You just held space. Sandra's eyes glistened. She squeezed his hand. Because I loved you even then, even when I didn't know it. Keanu smiled, a small, fragile smile that seemed to carry decades of pain and peace. Then let me return the favor. Let me be that space for you now. She leaned into him, her voice cracking as she whispered, I'm scared. He placed his forehead against hers. Me too, he admitted. But sometimes the things we're most scared of are the ones worth holding on to. They stayed like that, wrapped around each other in a quiet, trembling stillness, for what felt like hours. The world outside continued spinning its noisy, reckless stories, but inside that room there was only truth and breath and the fragile courage of two people choosing each other despite the noise. Later, when the night deepened and the weight of the world felt a little lighter, Sandra reached into a drawer and pulled out something she had hidden for years. A letter. A real one. One she had written but never sent. Not the one the tabloids claimed, but something older, more vulnerable, more her. Before you read this, she said, voice shaking, you need to know I wrote it during one of the darkest seasons of my life. I never sent it because I didn't want to burden you. But it's the truth, the real truth. She placed it in his hands. Keanu looked at her softly, then unfolded the paper. And as his eyes moved over the words, Sandra waited, not for judgment, but for understanding. What he read changed everything. The words he never expected. Keanu held the letter in his hands with a tenderness that made Sandra's chest ache. It was strange, she thought, how a simple piece of paper could feel heavier than 1,000 conversations. The edges were worn, faintly yellowed, the handwriting uneven in places, like each sentence had been written between breaths she was afraid to release. She watched him as he unfolded it, the quiet anticipation in his eyes, the respectful caution in the way he handled each crease, as though he wasn't opening a letter, but opening a piece of her heart she'd never dared to show anyone before. The room felt still. The air felt charged. A soft hum seemed to rise between them, the sound of 2 decades finally meeting in a single moment of truth. His eyes began scanning the words, and Sandra held her breath without realizing it. She knew every sentence by memory. She had written the letter during a year when she felt painfully misunderstood, swallowed by loneliness, and silently grieving a future she didn't know how to reach. A year when she had watched him from afar, wanting desperately to lean on him, but terrified of what it might cost. It wasn't a love confession, not fully. It was more honest than that, more vulnerable. Keanu's expression softened as he read, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes flickering with emotion she couldn't name. She saw the moment he reached the part she feared most, the part she had written in a whisper, almost ashamed of her own exhaustion. Some days, Keanu, I don't know how to be strong anymore. Not for Hollywood, not for the cameras, not even for myself. And when the world gets too loud, all I want is quiet, the kind of quiet I only ever found when you were near. You don't even have to speak. You never did. But you make me feel like it's safe to breathe. His breath hitched slightly. She saw it, felt it. And her heart cracked open all over again, not from pain, but from the rawness of finally letting someone witness the pieces she had hid even from herself. He kept reading. If life had been kinder, I think we would have found our way to each other sooner. But maybe timing isn't meant to be perfect. Maybe some connections are meant to linger in the background of our lives until we are ready to honor them. And Keanu, if I ever lose my way, promise me you won't turn away. Promise me you'll understand that sometimes I disappear not because I don't care, but because caring scares me more than being alone. Sandra blinked back tears, her fingers twisting nervously around the edge of a pillow. She had forgotten how raw her words were, how exposed she had allowed herself to be on that page. For years, she had wondered what would have happened if she had sent it. If maybe, just maybe, their story would have shifted sooner. But now, watching him read it, she knew something with absolute clarity. She hadn't sent it because neither of them had been ready. Not then, not yet. When Keanu finally reached the last line, his eyes lingered on it longer than the rest. You don't owe me anything. But if there is even a small corner of your heart where I exist, please keep me there. Even if it's quiet, even if it's simple. Because loving you in the only way I knew how has saved me more times than I can count. When he looked up, she felt exposed, as if she'd just stripped away every wall she'd ever built. But instead of the fear she expected, there was something else in his expression, something soft, steady, and deeply anchored. Keanu set the letter down, inhaled slowly, then reached for her hand with a gentleness that felt like a lifetime of unspoken understanding finally finding a voice. "Sandra," he said quietly, "why didn't you ever send this?" Her voice trembled. "Because I didn't want to complicate your life. You were grieving, you were rebuilding yourself, and I didn't want to be one more weight added to your heart." He shook his head, brushing his thumb over her knuckles with slow, deliberate tenderness. "But you weren't a weight. You were the light I kept trying to find." Her breath caught. "Keanu." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I thought I had to endure everything alone. I thought opening my heart again would break it all over. But when I read your words, all I felt was relief. Relief that maybe I wasn't the only one who scared myself with how much I cared." A quiet tear slipped down Sandra's cheek. He caught it with his thumb, not wiping it away but holding it there, honoring the truth behind it. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know you felt that deeply." "That's the thing," he said with a small, melancholic smile. "We both felt too much. We were just too afraid to say it." A silence followed, not empty, but full. Full of every moment they'd missed, every chance they'd hesitated on, every breath they'd taken while standing next to each other pretending their hearts weren't trying to speak. "I don't want to miss anything else," Keanu said finally. "Not because of fear, not because of timing, not because of what people will say." Sandra felt her chest tight and her palms warm in his. "And what do you want, Keanu?" He exhaled deeply, a slow, grounding breath. And then he spoke the words she never expected from him, not in her wildest dreams, not even in her letter. "I want a future with you, not the kind the world imagines, not a performance, not a headline. I want the quiet kind, the real kind, a life in the spaces between the noise, a life where I get to hold your hand when no one's watching, a life where we don't have to pretend we're just friends if what we feel is so much more." Her heart pressed against her ribs so hard she could feel her pulse in her fingertips. She had waited years to hear something like this, not because she needed validation, but because she had always known, deep down always, that their connection was too rare, too profound to be dismissed as coincidence. Sandra leaned forward, her forehead touching his, both of them breathing the same trembling breath. "And if the world gets loud again," she whispered. "Then we turn it down together," he murmured, "because this time I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes, absorbing the truth of that promise, letting it settle into every corner of her soul that had once believed she was too late, too guarded, too complicated to fully love. But now she understood. She had simply been waiting for someone who spoke the same language of quiet devotion. Keanu gently cupped her face, lifting it just enough for their eyes to meet, blue and brown, soft and steady, reflecting years of longing finally given permission to breathe. And then, without fear, without hesitation, without the weight of 2 decades holding them back, he kissed her. It wasn't dramatic or urgent. It was slow, deep, reverent, a kiss that tasted like forgiveness and beginnings and home. When their lips parted, Sandra exhaled the words she had waited a lifetime to say aloud. "I choose you." Keanu smiled, a smile that made the room feel warmer, the future feel closer, and the past feel healed. "And I choose you," he whispered, "not just in this moment, in all of them." The storm outside quieted. The world beyond their walls faded. And the two of them, finally aligned in truth and timing, stepped into a new chapter not defined by what they had missed, but by what they were finally brave enough to embrace. A love not rushed, not performed, not imagined. A love finally lived.